Oh, hello, my name is Greg and welcome to, would you believe, Chapter 6 in my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. In this chapter I'm actually going to cover some work that I did quite some time ago, back in around about April 2015. It's late July 2017 now, and it's pretty cold here in Adelaide, hence the beanie. Anyway, the work that I'm going to cover in this chapter relates to the chassis rails on the car, which were missing from my car. So in this chapter, I'll detail what these chassis rails are, what they do, and the process that I went through in making my own version of them. When I first bought the car, I didn't actually realise these parts were missing. It was only when I got the car to my brother-in-law's place, where I stored it for a little while, as we were taking it off the trailer. My friend Alvin, who was helping me move it, mentioned, "Hey mate, you've got something missing here underneath the car," and he noticed these chassis rails were missing. I must admit, at that point I felt a bit apprehensive. I was thinking to myself, what have I taken on here? Because I realised we're looking at a car that's 67 years old. Chances of finding a second-hand version of these chassis rails from a wreck somewhere are pretty minimal. So I realised that I was going to have to make my own, and at that point make my own version of something that wasn't there. So I essentially had nothing to copy. So I knew it was going to be a challenge. Essentially this chapter really covers how I tackled this challenge. I hope you enjoy it. Well, here we are under the car, and I'm just going to show where the chassis rails are and what they do. So this is one of the chassis rails here. Can you see that? But I put my hand on. This is one of the chassis rails here. So it extends all the way from alongside the gearbox, going back. Here's a cross shaft that's forms part of the mechanical braking mechanism, and then the chassis rail continues on towards the back of the car. This is one of the floorboards, so that's one of the functions of the chassis rail. It supports the floorboards. Here, just what's the lighting here a bit, sorry. It's the fuel line, so that's mounted to the chassis rail. And here you can see the brake cable going to the back brakes, and brake cable going to the front brakes. And there's a chassis rail on the other side of the car, which is essentially a mirror image of the one on this side, apart from the fact that it doesn't have this cross shaft mounted to it. This is the first of a whole series of photos that I took of the chassis rails from Alvin's P3. I took a lot of photos, mainly because I needed quite a high level of detail in order to be able to replicate these parts. They were quite complicated, and actually a bit more complicated than I realised at first. There are two chassis rails which are a mirror image of each other. Now, fortunately, in the end, Alvin agreed to lend me one of the chassis rails from his car, which made my job a whole lot easier. This bracket is a bracket that goes between the two chassis rails at the back, and just keeps them at the right distance from each other. Now, in addition to copying the brackets that are attached to the chassis rails, I also had to copy these bolts which bolt the chassis rails to the remainder of the chassis. This is the cross shaft that I mentioned a bit earlier, also from Alvin's car. And again, in addition to copying the chassis rails, the brackets and the special bolts, I had to copy this cross shaft as well, which was missing from my car, but a really essential part, as it forms quite a key part of the braking mechanism. Just another shot of this cross shaft. Again, I had to take quite a number of shots to get the level of detail that I needed. In this case, I wasn't able to borrow this shaft from Alvin, so I had to take quite detailed drawings and sketches on the spot.
This is the first of a series of shots with the cross shaft actually in situ on Alvin's car. Again, I took quite a number of photos just to so I'd have a good idea of how to set it up when I got home after I'd made my version of the cross shaft. This is perhaps the clearest photo of the cross shaft and how it works within the whole setup of the mechanical braking mechanism. The P3, a bit unusual by today's standards, it had hydraulic brakes at the front and mechanical brakes at the rear. So if you look at this cross shaft, there's a cable that heads to the front of the car. That's activated actually by the brake pedal. And then there's a cable that goes to the rear of the car, which that then joins on to more rods, which eventually activate the rear brakes. But I'll cover that in some further photos later. First job after getting the chassis rail that I borrowed from Alvin home, and after taking some sort of rough sketches, was to do a much more detailed drawing with all the dimensions on the drawing. This helped me a great deal when it came to actually making my own version. I had to take drawings that both showed the side of the chassis rail, but also from the top, because the chassis rail had holes in the side for mounting brackets, and then holes on the top where the floor bolted down to it.
Also made quite detailed drawings for the brackets that go either side of the cross shaft that mount the cross shaft to the chassis. I made this rough and ready welding jig to help with making the chassis rails. I'll cover that in a bit more detail in a short video to follow. Well, this is my very rough and ready welding jig that I used to help me make my chassis rails. The jig had two functions really. Firstly, I used it to help mark out how I needed to cut the pieces of steel that I used to make this part. And then I used it to help clamp the bits of steel together so that I could weld them in the right place. I used 2 bits of angle line, much longer than these 2 pieces of scrap that I have here, and welded them to make like a Z section. But the challenge I had is, as I may have mentioned in some of the other slides, is the chassis rails tapered from, if you go from the back of the chassis rail from thick to thin, and then from thin to thick, and then from up to anyway, they tapered about 3 times along the length. The main sort of section, I guess the back 2/3 of it, I made first. So I made this jig so that the distance between this piece of steel and that piece of steel corresponded with the widest dimension at the back of the chassis rail, and then as we go along the welding jig here, the distance between this piece of steel and that piece of steel corresponded with the narrowest dimension. So I could use it. I'll try and demonstrate it. I need to imagine this steel is much longer than what it is, and it actually goes the full length of the jig. So I'd lay one piece of steel in like so, and the next piece of steel in like so, and then sort of clamp it in place so everything's nice and square. And then I could scribe along the overlap line that you see here, and that would give me a scribed line that corresponded with where I needed to cut the steel, so that when I then place them back in the jig again, end to end like so, I would have a taper that I was trying to achieve. Hope that kind of explains it. It's a little hard to explain, sorry.
A key tool in the manufacture of my chassis rails was this bandsaw, which I'd just newly purchased a little bit prior to starting this project. Nice little bandsaw that I got from Hare and Forbes Machinery Warehouse.
This shot is from the very early stages as I was starting to make my chassis rails.
This photo is a much more progressed version of my chassis rails. Again, you can see Alvin's chassis rail there in the foreground. And it looks like his is longer than mine, but that's maybe a bit of an optical illusion here. You can see I've still got a little bit of welding to do on mine. In the first instance, I did a process called sort of stitch welding, where you do a bead of weld and then a fairly large gap and another bead of weld. Eventually, I welded pretty much the whole seam, but this is about sort of 3/4 way through the process here. This shot, you can see again Alvin's chassis rail there to the left, and I've put the bend on my left chassis rail to match his, and I still have the bend that's about, I guess, 3/4 away along the chassis rail to put on the right hand version. And here's just a shot of my trusty Mig Welder. Very happy with this welder. Again, it's a fairly recent purchase. Certainly glad I bought it. I did have a stick welder that I used before this, but for a job of this sort of size, that would have taken a lot longer using that sort of welder. This welder has a wire feed mechanism that makes big long welding jobs like this much faster to do. On this shot, you can see one of the brackets that I welded to the side of the chassis rail. There's also, I guess, what I'd describe as captive nuts. So that's a bit of a weird term, I suppose. But I'll show you some shots of those. I also had to make these captive nuts and make some tooling to make them. Here's one of the captive nuts that I was talking about. It's like a steel cage that contains a square nut, so that when you're using this bolt to bolt the floor down, the nut is contained, so you don't need to have someone else underneath the car holding the nut still whilst you bolt it down.
Here's my almost finished version of the brackets that hold the chassis rail to the chassis, along with the drawings that I used to help with the process.
This is one of the latter processes in my chassis rail manufacture. There's quite a lot of welding involved in making these rails in the way that I made them, and that caused some distortion of the rail from where it should be straight. It was a little bit bent like a banana in places. So I used my trusty hydraulic shop press to gently nudge it back into place, or back into shape rather. This shot and a couple of further shots, my first attempt at fitting my chassis rails to my car. Before I did the finish coat of paint on them, I just wanted to fit them, check that they fitted okay, and just make some final adjustments. In the end, they fitted pretty well with only really minor tweaking required, which I've got to say is one hell of a relief, because to this point in time I'd put quite a lot of time and effort and work into them. This is the first shot I took of the cross shaft that I was making to copy the one I measured up from Alvin's car. I used I guess a slightly different idea to the original. I've copied the look of it quite well, and the brackets are more or less an identical copy. The only real major difference is the originals would have had a bronze bearing bush inside, whereas I made mine with modern sealed ball bearings. Cross shaft has a very heavy, I guess you could almost call it a bracket, but rather a lever really at one end where the brake cables attach. That would have been bent on a very heavy duty press on the original. Mine, I cut the steel most of the way through, then bent it, and then welded in the gap that was created after it was bent. A bit of a different way of doing it, but bending steel of this thickness would have been pretty hard work, so this seemed like a better way of doing it to me. This is the first shot of my cross shaft fitted to the car. Again, I was just really trying it for size and before I've put any paint on it. And again, it fitted pretty well. I shouldn't sound so surprised, but anyway, it was certainly a relief when it did fit well. And here's a shot of my chassis rails painted up, the cross shaft painted up, and even the brake cables cleaned and painted up in rust primer at this point, and all looking pretty good. It was really good to have all this in there because for a long time this car hasn't had any working brakes at all. So this was certainly a big first step in restoring some braking capacity on this car again.
This is the first shot I took of some press tooling that I made to help me make those sort of steel cages for the captive nuts that I showed earlier in the show. I guess it is a bit over the top to be making your own tooling, to be making a part like this, but I did try and find the part. I could find a very similar sort of captive nut in British Standard Whitworth, in quarter Whitworth. But I couldn't find anything in British Standard Fine, which is what was originally fitted to the car. So yeah, I guess I am a bit obsessive, so I went ahead and made my own tooling. Now, to start the process of making these sort of steel cages for the captive nuts, I cut these blanks out of sheet steel. As you can see, there's a hole in the middle. The purpose of that hole at this stage was to allow me to place that hole over a locating pin on the tooling that I made. In this shot, you can clearly see the locating pin that I put in the middle of the piece of tooling. Now, the only way I could think of doing this was to basically form the steel cages in two stages. So in the first stage, I'd fold up two ends at right angles, and then the second part of the process was to then fold that fold halfway down. It'll make more sense when I show you some shots further along. This shot shows most of the steel cages that I was making formed up in the first stage that I was talking about, where I folded the two end tabs up at right angles. In order to do this forming, I had to heat up the parts, the steel blanks, with a blowtorch to get them fairly hot and make the steel sort of malleable enough to form. Just another shot of the blanks at the first stage. Just to the left of the blanks, there's a piece of steel which is part of my tooling. Now this piece, along with an identical piece, are bits that I screwed into the tooling for the second stage of the process, which I'll try and describe. Starting the second stage of the forming process now, where I put that second bend into the sides of the blank. This perhaps shows that second part of the forming process a little more clearly as I'm taking a finished part out of the die. I'll just explain one aspect of my tooling at this point. As you can see, there's a locating pin in the centre of the bottom part of the tooling. And then I drilled, as I mentioned earlier, I drilled a hole in the middle of all the blanks. So having that locating pin in that hole just allows me to locate the part centrally in the die, so that everything's sort of formed up square and symmetrical. Here's the almost finished part. Just one more stage to go now, where I turn that hole in the middle into a slotted hole. And here we go, making the slotted hole on the milling machine. Pretty much the finished part now, with the slotted hole and the square nut that fits inside of it. Just holding one of the captive nuts up against one of the brackets, just to show you sort of how it works. Showing the chassis rails actually in my car now. At this stage they're still painted in grey primer, as I was just doing some final adjustments before putting a finish coat on them. I also had to make some special bolts that hold the chassis rails into the car. You can see an example of one. I'm not sure whether I borrowed that or where that came from. That was the only one I had, so I needed 4 in all. I decided to make mine out of stainless steel, just for corrosion resistance, and they don't particularly need to be high tensile, so that was all good. Just showing the finished version of my bolts here. I turned up the blanks, did the screw thread on them on the lathe, and then cut the sort of hexagon head on my milling machine.
I'll conclude this chapter at this point. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. I must admit, this is probably one of the bigger challenges that I faced with the restoration. It was fairly early in the restoration, and it was a bit of a turning point in a way, because there was a time there when I was thinking, hey, have I bitten off more than I can chew here? So actually getting, I guess, a successful outcome, and actually making these chassis rails myself and them fitting and working was a big confidence booster for me, and I think in some ways it gave me the courage to continue with it, really.